Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce uh, Gillian Asquith as our next speaker. Gillian teaches biblical studies and is the academic dean of the Melbourne School of Theology. Anyway, moving on. Her doctoral thesis used documentary papyri to analyse Paul's letters and their openings. Is that right? Yeah. So Gillian is a fellow member of the Papyri Society. So it's great to have you here, Gillian, and to hear what you have to say about exploring the multiple interconnected social identities of first century Jewish followers. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Well, many of you will be familiar with the story of the two Oxford classicists, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt. In the late 19th century, they became aware of papyrus documents found in Egypt that were beginning to appear on the antiquities market. And so they organised an expedition to excavate the ancient rubbish mounds at Oxyrhynchus. There, they hit the mother lode of papyri. There were biblical texts, Greek literary texts, and papyri that were ordinary documents associated with everyday life, letters, receipts, contracts, some between private individuals, others relating to matters of government at various levels. Collectively, they're known as documentary papyri. Other sites have also been excavated. Thousands of these documentary papyri have been published, and enticingly, there are still many more lying unpublished in library collections. But even though we're now more than 100 years downstream from Grenfell and Hunt's initial expeditions, documentary papyri are still an underutilized resource in New Testament studies. I was delighted that Chris Forbes referred to them this morning, but there's still a lot to be gleaned from documentary papyri. Macquarie University's New Docs series was a pioneering work. It's now been given a new lease of life under our very own James Harrison. There's a set of commentaries that's slowly being produced, coming out at a very slow rate of knots, the papyrological commentary on the New Testament. And Peter Artsgrabner, who Chris again mentioned this morning, is heading up that commentary series. A new series has recently appeared, published by Brill, called Papyri and the New Testament. But there's still more untapped potential. So this afternoon, I'm going to address how documentary papyri can inform the perspectives and behavior of early Jesus followers within the New Testament subdiscipline of empire critical studies. James C. Scott was an American political scientist and anthropologist. He only died 2 years ago. And for someone not working in the field of biblical studies, the influence of Scott's work on biblical studies has been substantial. So Scott's interests lay in exploring how subjugated peoples expressed resistance towards the powers who dominated them. And so his work has found fertile ground among New Testament academics who are working on empire critical studies. And I should preface what I'm going to present this afternoon with an acknowledgement that empire criticism tends to polarize people. So in a room of this many people, there'll be those who love it and those who hate it. So I'll lay my cards out straight away, so you don't need to be guessing my perspective. I'm in the camp that does think there are intentional, subversive expressions of counter-imperial sentiment in the New Testament. But I do think, too, that some elements within empire critical studies are overstated. For example, the notion that much of the counter-imperial sentiment was encoded to avoid repercussions if, say, Paul's letters fell into the wrong hands. I think they're overstated. But my purpose today is not to argue for or against the validity of empire critical studies. Instead, I'm going to advocate with evangelistic zeal for greater use of papyrological resources in the field of empire criticism, so that we can gain a better rounded understanding of the social influences on Jesus' family, friends, and followers that would have shaped their worldviews and their behavior. One of the earliest New Testament academics writing on empire criticism, Richard Horsley, wrote that Scott's work can help biblical studies expand the spectrum of social reality that they deal with. And it can enlarge their field of vision to include the emotional, cultural dimension of subordinated people's lives. I wholeheartedly agree with Horsley's sentiments, but there are two problems when it comes to applying Scott's work to the world of the New Testament. The first is the use of primary source evidence. James Harrison has bemoaned the fact that in general, and I quote, scholars have focused on the literary evidence of the literate upper classes throughout the empire at the expense of the local documentary, numismatic, archaeological, and iconographic evidence of the Mediterranean cities in which the early churches flourished. This is true of empire critical scholars, and particularly true when it comes to documentary evidence in the form of papyri and ostraca. Inscriptions do tend to fare a little better. So if you were to pick up a volume on New Testament empire criticism, you'd be hard-pressed to find any reference at all to papyri, except for maybe a nod to co-opted imperial language. So words used in the New Testament like kurios or soteria that were used in an imperial context as well. But documentary papyri allow us to peer over the shoulders of people in the Roman Empire, and they allow us to catch first-hand glimpses into their lived realities. To be sure, most of these are in Roman Egypt. Some are from first century Palestine, but the majority from Roman Egypt. But their circumstances would nevertheless have been broadly similar to those of people in other Roman provinces around the Mediterranean basin. So that's the first problem. The second problem in applying Scott's work is the adoption by empire critics of Scott's two social categories, dominating and subjugated or subordinate. And my view is that this encourages a rather too simplistic bifurcation of groups that understates what we might call the complexities of interconnected identities. And once you have people juggling complex interconnected identities, it becomes harder to argue that their behavior would conform to what you might expect as consistent with just one of those identities. And it's these interconnected identities I want to show you this afternoon from papyrological resources. I'm going to persuade you that empire critical studies can't afford to proceed without reference to this kind of evidence. So let's start with a soldier who's known from two letters that he writes back home to his family in the 2nd century CE. The first letter sends details of the soldier's recruitment into the Roman fleet, the Classis Missinensis. Help, Jasper. So if I... Makes me feel better that Jasper's having trouble too.
There we go.
There we go. So what's the trick?
Just that one. So I think it just had to be.
Just have to press it a bit harder.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Appian to his father and Lord Epimachus, many greetings. Before all else, I pray that you're well and that you may always be strong and healthy together with my sister and her daughter and my brother. Thank you. I give thanks to the Lord Serapis because he rescued me immediately when I was in danger at sea. When I arrived at the Misenum, I received 3 gold pieces from Caesar for traveling expenses, and it's well with me. Therefore, I ask you, my Lord Father, write me a note, first about your health, second about my siblings, third, so that I can make obeisance for your handwriting, because you educated me well. And because of this, I hope to advance quickly, God's willing. Give Captiton many greetings, and my siblings, and Serenilla and my friends. I sent my portrait to you via Euctemenos. My name is Antonius Maximus. I pray that you're well. Company Athonike. On the other side of the papyrus, there's the address to Philadelphia, to Epimachus, from Appian, his son. If you've done any work on Paul's letters, you might have come across this particular papyrus in regards to the expression of thanks to the Lord Serapis. Scholars have tried to argue that this expression of thanks to Lord Serapis corresponds with Paul's expressions of thanksgiving in his letters. It's unlikely it does correspond because in Paul's letters, Paul gives thanks to God for his recipients, not for himself, as this letter writer does. But there's more to be gleaned from this letter than simply looking at that sentence about thanksgiving. We learn from this letter that the soldier is Greco-Egyptian. And following his recruitment to the fleet, he's been given the Roman name Antonius Maximus. And although he mentions that he's been given this name in this first letter, he still signs himself on the reverse, Appian, his son. We don't know how long elapses between the first letter that he sends back to his father and the second. But by the time the second one appears, sufficient time has elapsed for Appian to be married with 3 children. In this second letter, he uses his Roman name in the salutation to his family. And he tells them too that his youngest child, a son, has been named Maximus after his father. In the first letter, Appian prayed to the Egyptian god Serapis, but on his honorable discharge from the navy, he can expect to be granted Roman citizenship. And one scholar has asked, so does that make Appian an Egyptian, a Greek, or a Roman in the making? There's another set of correspondence that we have that shows how the granting of Roman citizenship to military veterans impacted their self-identity when they returned to civilian life. We're in the 2nd century again. So BGU 3747 has something on both sides. On one side, it has the copy of a letter from a government administrative official called Ptolemaeus to the prefect of Egypt, who at this point is Avidius Heliodorus. The other side of the document contains Heliodorus's reply. So the government official, Ptolemaeus, informs Heliodorus that some of the tax collectors appointed in his district are refusing to follow his orders, and they're refusing to allow him to audit their accounts. Now, these tax collectors included Roman citizens, Alexandrian citizens, and military veterans, who, of course, many of whom would be Roman citizens as a result of having been military veterans. And this is significant because by dint of their citizenship, these 3 groups enjoyed valuable privileges not afforded to the hoi polloi. They were exempt from the Roman poll tax, and they were exempt from certain government-imposed public duties. In his letter, Ptolemaeus explains that the reason these tax collectors are behaving as they are is that they don't think they should be treated like the local Egyptian tax collectors. These citizen tax collectors thought that they should be exempt from more of the duties or obligations that they still shared with non-citizens. But Heliodorus's reply indicates that they're skating on thin ice. He replies, "In respect of those who are appointed to public duties but who do not want to obey like other agents of the state, you can bring them before the epistrategos, a much more senior government official, who will force them to fulfill their required duties." So the dynamics of the circumstances presented by the two letters on this papyrus illustrate just how unwieldy a simplistic bifurcation of power relations is. Here, the hierarchy of dominating and subordinate groups accounts for the wayward tax collectors' presumption that their privileges over those people whose legal identity was simply Egyptian should be increased. But these military veterans who are now citizens and think they should have more privileges, like Appian in the first letter that we looked at, would culturally have been Greco-Egyptians whose legal identity had changed on account of them having served in the Roman army. And now they're identifying themselves with the social elite. So as far as legal status is concerned, they've switched sides from the subordinating to the dominating. And now it seems that socially too, their social identity as members of the elite trumps any prior loyalties that they may have had to their subordinate social origins. But complicating the picture further are the tax collectors' acts of resistance against the Roman system of privileges in which they find themselves. Their acts of resistance, their failure to obey orders, express critique of the system. They're at odds with that element of Roman imperial ideology that still requires them to fulfill duties to the state in the same way that non-citizens must. So on the one hand, these tax collectors enjoy some benefits of the system of Roman social elitism, but on the other, they express dissatisfaction with that system. So the new allegiances of these recalcitrant tax collectors only stretch as far as their new legal and social identities benefit them. So documentary papyri show us that people don't always fall into neat categories. And we see that with the Apostle Paul's own circumstances. As a Jewish Christian, Paul moved within a subgroup of a subordinate culture. As a Roman citizen, however, he was at least nominally associated with the dominating culture, and he took advantage of that citizenship when he was arrested without due process in Philippi and Jerusalem. So documentary papyri can provide insights into how people in the ancient world navigated these complexities of interconnected identities. And sometimes when we might expect that various aspects of behavior are incompatible with each other, maybe they're only inconsistencies because of these interconnected identities. So the voices emerging from these papyri might help empire critics explore how Paul himself navigated his interconnected identities, and might help us perhaps further nuance Paul's stance towards the empire, particularly in Romans 13 when he urges prayers for those in power. But there's a further problem with a simplistic bifurcation of a population into subordinating or dominating. And that is that this simplistic bifurcation can hinder us from identifying other ideological critiques in the New Testament, additional to or other than counter-imperial sentiment. Cynthia Long Westfall examines the letter of James from the perspective of economic conditions in the Roman Empire. And she's particularly interested in James's critique of the rich. Her purpose is to demonstrate an anti-imperial perspective in the letter towards the Roman Empire and to the Jewish Christian elite because of their corruption by imperial ideology. Now, Westphal limits her application of James's critique to those Jewish Christians who she says, quote, have been influenced by the entitlement and pride inherent in the Roman Empire's economic system. And so far, so good. I think she's correct. But this application is unnecessarily restrictive, I would argue, because the interconnected identities of Jewish Christians in the Roman Empire suggest that there's an additional ideological critique going on in the letter of James, more than simply anti-imperial sentiment. James opens his letter by addressing the hardships that his audience was facing. These hardships, or trials, according to James, are a form of testing, and when they're endured, they'll bring about eschatological benefit. Verse 12, blessed is the person who perseveres under trial, because when he's stood the test, he'll receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. Wisdom features prominently in the letter of James. The first mention of it, chapter 1, verse 5, corresponds with the Old Testament premise that wisdom must be sought out. If anyone lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. We could summarize the presentation of wisdom in the Old Testament like this. Wisdom was concerned with a framework for right living that's grounded in a theology of the orderliness of creation. And to gain wisdom, you needed to ardently seek after it. Wisdom was very closely aligned with Torah ethics. And generally speaking, if you followed the way of wisdom, you could expect to prosper. By extension, if you prospered, then you must be righteous and wise and blessed by God. And we see evidence of this last point in the way Jesus uses a particular parable to drive home a point. Jesus used parables to confront his audience with a new way of thinking about the kingdom of God. He took standard scenarios and injected an element of shock or surprise into them. He turned people's expectations upside down in order to elicit a response from his audience. So think about the parable of the rich fool. When the people around Jesus heard the opening words, there was a certain rich man whose ground produced a good crop. They would have thought they had a fair idea what was going to happen. Traditional wisdom meant that wealth was a blessing from God. So the story of a rich man was bound to be a story about someone who was pleasing to God in every way, someone who was leading an exemplary life, someone who was going to be welcomed home into Abraham's bosom when he finally died after a long and happy life. And in this parable, the man's being very sensible with his new surplus wealth. He's not squandering it on fripperies or wasting it on wine, women, and fast camels. He's going to store it in some new barns. He's being prudent. He's saving it for the future. But then it all goes horribly wrong. He dies. It's not the right ending. But it shocks the audience into rethinking their priorities. And the parable can only do this because of the existing framework that the audience has, that wealth and prosperity are indications that a person has gained wisdom and blessings in the traditional, proverbial Old Testament sense. There's even more going on with the background to wisdom in James's letter. By the 1st century, a corollary to the teaching that the righteous prosper and the wicked perish, as described, say, in Psalm 1, had developed. The corollary is that prosperity indicates that a person is righteous, suffering is a punishment for wickedness. And we see this perspective behind the question asked by Jesus' disciples about the man with congenital blindness. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? John 9:2. So James opens his letter by addressing the hardships that his audience was facing in chapter 1, by linking them with a positive impact. It's turning on its head traditional wisdom way of thinking from the Old Testament. He says, "Consider it a great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing." James wasn't unique in teaching that trials were to be viewed positively. Wisdom as a concept continued to develop during the intertestamental period, and some of the intertestamental books, such as the Book of Sirach, describe the positive aspects of hardships and trials. But it seems that this development of wisdom hadn't found its way into Jewish mainstream thought to the extent that it actually influenced people's lives. Instead, it seems that it was this traditional, proverbial prosperity wisdom that was uppermost in people's minds. So it's no coincidence that James juxtaposes his first mention of wisdom with the trials that his recipients are facing. James needs to reorient their understanding of wisdom away from the prosperity type of thinking that would cause them to interpret their trials as punishment. Instead, the trials are a form of testing, and when they're endured, they'll bring about eschatological benefit. So we're seeing a link between James's teaching on trials and wisdom. And let's extend that now to James's critique of the rich. As I said, I agree with Cynthia Long Westfall. The recipients of James's letter would likely have been influenced by cultural values embedded in the Roman Empire's economic system, the entitlement and pride inherent in the Roman Empire's economic system, as Westfall had put it. But the recipients of James's letter were characterized by interconnected identities. If we assume that they were Jewish Christians, which I think is reasonable, then it's likely that a Jewish sapiental perspective also complemented these Roman values. So James critiques these Jewish Christian elite, not only because they've taken on board imperial ideology, but also because of their faulty theology. So an anti-imperial critique doesn't exclude the critique of additional ideologies at the same time. But I think perhaps empire critical scholars sometimes forget that. When it comes to New Testament empire critical studies, the vast corpus of documentary papyri seems to be viewed as the poor cousin to other documentary sources, such as inscriptions and coins. But these brief examples show the potential that papyri have for contributing to empire criticism when they're viewed from a socio-historical perspective. They provide the insights into lived realities of people juggling the demands and priorities of multiple interconnected identities. So I've argued that greater awareness of the influences of these interconnected identities on the behavior and attitudes of people in the ancient world may help empire critic scholars avoid an oversimplistic and reductionist interpretation of the behavior and attitudes of the New Testament protagonists in relation to the Roman Empire. So it's my hope that the increasing number of resources that explore how documentary papyri inform the world of the New Testament, such as Jim's series, New Docs, it's my hope that they might pique the interest of empire critical scholars, such that documentary papyri might enjoy increasing representation in future empire critical studies. Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian. It's great that there's someone who's actually mining the documentary papyri for all it's worth. We need more scholars to be doing that. Because there's a treasure trove out there in that papyri. Has anyone got any questions, comments? Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Gillian, for a terrific paper. First of all, just a comment, and a sad one at that, and it's the fact that the new doc series will be pretty well exclusively inscriptions, because we're dealing with local cities, and as you know, papyri are geographically located in Egypt and not the major biblical cities. So it's just how it works. So your great hope may not be realised. I'm so sorry. I was just going to ask, in your thought about this, have you not only thought about the Greco-Roman papyri, but are there in any of the Jewish papyri published by Hannah Cotton and, of course, Cherikova in times past, are there in any of the Jewish papyri anti-imperial perspectives that might be helpful?
Very definitely there are. I mean, there are the obvious ones from the Bar Kokhba revolt, but the one that you mentioned, so P. Cotton, published by Hannah Cotton just very recently in the last, 12 months or so, 2 years, something like that. It deals with a 2nd century papyrus that is the recordings of court proceedings against 2 Jewish men who, if I remember correctly, had not paid the manumission tax on a couple of slaves. So there are minutes of proceedings in great detail. I have thought about that, and I've thought about it in relation to the question that Jesus was asked when given a coin, it's got Caesar's image on it. What should we do? And Jesus says, render to Caesar what's Caesar's and render to God what is God's. And it's made me thought, if tax evasion was a relatively commonplace occurrence in the 1st and 2nd century, then Jesus's command to actually pay your taxes and be radical in other ways, the topsy-turvy world of the kingdom of God, rendering to God what is God's, is radical enough. That is anti-imperial sentiment, if you like. You don't need to express acts of resistance by not paying your taxes. Pay them. So that one, yeah, that did pique my interest, and I had thought about how it might inform us more.
Well, thank you, Gillian. As you know, we're very interested, several of us are very interested in what you're doing. Have you got a couple of key words or key concepts that you think haven't been adequately explored in the papyri in relation to what you're saying about empire criticism? You said a couple of obvious ones, but there must be others that you're looking for when you look through the papyri.
Yeah, there are. Thank you. So one of them I briefly alluded to at the beginning in terms of something within empire criticism that I think is overstated, and that is the idea that Paul in particular was encoding elements of counter-imperial sentiment because he was worried that his letters would fall into the wrong hands. These are called veiled hidden transcripts. So I thought, well, why don't we have a look at the at papyrus letters to see if we can. It's kind of difficult because if something's veiled, like how are we going to see it? It might be so well encoded that 2,000 years later we can't figure out something. But if something's not encoded, if something's more overt, then we can definitely spot that. And what I found were that there are examples of people engaging in shady practice that, if it came to the attention of the imperial authorities, would get them into a huge amount of trouble, such as cooking the books by temple priests, there's one particular letter where somebody who is friends with the Roman auditor writes to a priest and says, "Oh, I'm just giving you a heads up, the auditor's coming for a visit, so you better get your books in order. If you haven't got time to get your books in order, send them up to me and I'll cook them for you, like I did last time, and I'll get you off." And I think there's so much potential for a letter like that to get the priests into trouble, particularly as priests, the priesthood enjoyed tax concessions. So you'd think that they would want to make absolutely sure that any shady business goes undetected. So that's an example of somebody expressing a small act of resistance against the Roman Empire, colluding with one another, but obviously not being the slightest bit bothered that that letter could fall into the wrong hands. So I think with veiled hidden transcripts, the papyri have a lot to offer.
That's really interesting. I must confess I don't know so much about the first couple of centuries, but just thinking the late 3rd, early 4th century, Don, I'm sure, can give me the reference. You know, the man who goes to conduct a legal case, and when he gets there, he finds that the requirement to sacrifice is being enforced. Obviously, sometimes it was and sometimes it wasn't. So he just casually says, "So I got my brother to do it, my legal brother to do it for me," and went on with the case. Now that's pretty overt, isn't it? I mean, the Romans must have been able to turn a blind eye, because it's not quite an official document, but it's certainly reasonably public that he didn't do it, that he got someone else to do it for him. And in the case of Phileas, he when he's being interrogated, I know this is later than your stuff, but he said, his lawyers say, "Oh, he already did it. He did it in secret." And his brother's trying to save him, said, "Yes, he did. Yes, he did." But I mean, the Romans must have known there was a fair bit of that sort of thing going on. As I think Paul McKechnie said, they weren't silly, were they? They weren't quite the CIA. But what do you think of examples like that, or are they not actually relevant to what you're saying?
No, I think they are, and that I mean, what I think with Paul's letters is that certainly in terms of the Roman congregation, he hasn't been to Rome. Yes, he knows a number of the people there. We know from Romans 16 and his greetings. But if his letters were so well encoded that the Romans wouldn't figure them out, what are the chances that his recipients would actually figure out the encoding? So I think what you're indicating there, Alana, is that these people were engaged in dodgy practices, and they did get away with it, and didn't seem to feel the need to encode things. I don't know. What I will say is, if this has piqued your interest, the work for today's paper is published in the book that's in the that you mentioned earlier, Alana, with my name against the chapter. It's actually open access. So it's a book where a number of people working in different fields were asked to consider new methodologies for empire criticism. So somebody has written on numismatics, somebody else on coins, various literary forms of criticism. But the editor told me the last time I spoke to him that he's actually applied for funding to try and get a team together to think about how papyri can inform empire criticism, particularly on the lines of veiled hidden transcripts. So I was kind of excited about that.
Thank you. Leaving aside the faith in the supernatural aspects and looking at the 1st century and the parts that the Romans played in history, would you agree that it was the Romans who benefited from Christianity the most, because it decimated Judaism, it quelled the zealotry of the day? That's the first part of it. And if there was any encoding to be done, then it was the Romans who wrote the history, and they're the ones who have the biggest stake in it. Secondly, if you look at the word evangelion, how does that uh, figure in your position in this? If it was it a later addition to what we know as the Gospels, Euangelia? Why did they call them Euangelia if it's a Roman term of victory and conquest? Who did that benefit?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. I'll address that one. So euangelion is used in different contexts. So it appears in Isaiah in the LXX. So it was a word that Jews would have been familiar with just in terms of good news. But then it was used too about the good news, not necessarily in an imperial context. So one family writes to another to say, I heard the good news of the wedding of one person to another. But then it is used in an imperial context to talk about military victories. So I think the use of the word euangelion by, say, the gospel writers was a deliberately subversive choice of word to say that instead of the good news being the birth of the god Augustus, so the Prian inscription says the good news for the world is the beginning of the birth of Augustus. It's actually now Jesus. So that's not good news for the Romans at all.
Evangelion was used by the gospel writers. Wasn't it later ascribed to those stories, just as the names of the so-called writers was ascribed and said, oh, it actually didn't, did it?
Yeah, I know what you're doing. You're thinking about the titles of the Gospels, whereas the actual word good news appears in the text itself. The beginning of the good news. It's on Jesus's lips, on John the Baptist, repent and believe the good news. It's not simply a title at the bottom of the Gospels. Texts as they have come down to us in copies. I'm not following you. I'm sorry.
Again, by the gospel story, verse the zealotry.
I'll answer that one. Why did they persecute the Christians?
Well, Candace,
In droves. So anyhow, we'll move on. I've just got one question, and that is, what happens, or what goes into the mix when Paul says, when he's writing his letters, Paul the apostle, and he doesn't give his Roman name.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? I would suspect, because when he's writing his letters, what's the foremost identity that's in his mind? It's not going to be his Roman citizenship.
So he plays that down.
I think so.
Until he has to.
I think so. Yeah, that's a really good point, Don. Couched as a question. Very good.
Well, thank you, Gillian, for that wonderful paper. And we now have Lynn. Thank you, Lynn.